Sorry, we got started without you before I remembered to record, but here we are recording. So to circle back, this is viewing it in economics, and it's not an apology for the business, but it's seeking to understand this business in its economic terms, to understand how the system arose and how this system continued, and even how this system was eventually gotten rid of. Right? So this particular approach, sometimes because you're dealing with numbers, can sometimes appear that the awfulness of this business is obscured because you're looking at the balance sheet, right? I just want to make sure you understand that's not his intent, nor is that his belief, although I don't know Klein at all. But what the aspects of this that this approach does, it's somewhat of an artifact because there hadn't been, when he began this work, a lot of rigorous academic investigation of the slave trade. It was an issue that, because it's such an awful practice, that there was a sense that we should condemn it and move on, right? Where Klein is part of a group of folks, a type of historian who focuses on the numbers and the business aspect of it. So this approach is going to privilege certain things. Numbers are going to be of paramount importance, but I just want to make sure that you understand that this is not an apology for the business of slavery. It's a rigorous academic investigation of how the system operates as a business, as it goes about the things it does, right? So that's what's going to be in the forefront. All right. So this approach is a particular type of approach that he's building upon some remarkable sets of information. Now, Christina, one of the things you suggested is that there's written information. What kind of written information is there about the Atlantic slave trade?
Logs of how many slaves were brought over.
Okay, where do we find these logs?
Good question.
Okay. Anybody have an idea?
Would it be the shipping manifests?
Okay, shipping manifests of what?
The boats that are bringing over the slaves.
Okay. So what are these manifests going to tell us?
Was on the ship, who's on the ship?
Okay, what else?
Possibly how many survived.
Right, how many members survived? What else?
Like where they came from and where they're going to.
Okay, where they came from, where they're going to. Good. What else?
Their age.
Okay, their age in rough approximations. Yes.
Whether they're male, female, and children.
Correct. Their gender. Right. What else?
Dates of the journey.
What's that? Dates of the journey. Yes. Where the ship is leaving from, where it is delivering its cargo to, when it returns. Right. What else? Think of anything else? How much slaves cost? How much they sold for? What were the terms of the sale? How long was the note outstanding? Was the voyage profitable or not? Right? A whole host of really rich sources of information. Now, here's the thing. Timothy, where did we find these things?
On the shipping manifests.
Okay. Shipping manifests for what?
Would it be the various trade companies using? How do you mean, like physically where, or?
Yes. Or no, not necessarily physically where, although physically where could be part of it. But where are these things recorded?
where like a logbook
Okay, the logbook of what?
of the ship.
The ship, right? Now, sometimes companies may own several ships, but they do not constitute any great mass of the voyages. There's no Standard Oil of the Atlantic slave trade, where one company controls most of the slave trade. Most of this is gathered from individual logs, which means some graduate student had to go through and record all the information, and it was put into a database. And that's what Klein is drawing upon, right? When he writes the first edition, there were somewhere around 20,000 voyages that were recorded into a searchable database that recorded where the ships left from, how long the journeys were, what they, how many people they purchased, how many people they delivered, what it cost, right? How many members of the crew were there? How were the shares divvied up? How about the investors? How did the investors make out, right? Each one of these things is a rich piece of information in this log, but until it gets into something that could be used by scholars, it is just one ship story.
Mm-hmm.
So what Klein is drawing upon was 20,000 voyages that were, the information was extracted and recorded in a database. When he first wrote this, the first edition, there was a CD. I remember I went to see one of his colleagues at an AHA conference later, and they were talking about this database on a CD that was available. You could buy it, right? And so when he wrote this revised edition, there was an additional, I think, 30 or 20,000 voyages that were included. Pretty much every voyage from French ports were recorded over the length of the slave trade. Pretty much all of the English voyages over the length of the slave trade. A significant portion of the Portuguese were recorded over the slave trade. So this database provides information that turns those individual logs into something that could be utilized at a larger scale. So prior to the creation of this rich database, you couldn't speak with any certainty about what average slaves cost. You couldn't speak with any certainty over how deadly was the Middle Passage, right? But with this information, you suddenly are able to apply the research methods of quantitative economics to it, because you have data to look at, right? So one aspect of this is that this was an enormous amount of work that was put into creating this database. So previous historians couldn't do that, right? So Melissa, you're my historian, right?
Yes.
All right. So this is a bonus for you, but everyone can benefit. One of the things Klein talks about is he builds upon something that was controversial at the time, right? Let me see if I can share my screen here. I think it's on my share list here. Not that one. Don't look at that one. We haven't looked at this one yet. It's, let me see if I can find it. It's this one. So one of the things he draws upon here is that a historian by the name of Philip Curtin in 1969, I believe it came out. I should look, books on my shelf. And what Curtin did was he addressed the question of, well, how big was the Atlantic slave trade, right? A pretty basic question. And because it's a basic historical question, there was a site for it. So he went on to he's steeped in the historical literature on it, and he looks at this source and it refers to 20 million people who were dragged out of Africa and brought to the New Worlds in the slave trade, right? So you could look at that footnote and say, aha, there it is. There's the information I'm looking for. This is the volume of the Atlantic slave trade. But Curtin, partly because he had reasons to be suspicious, but also partly because he's a good historian, looks at the site and he goes, well, I wonder where that figure came from. So he looks at the footnote, and the footnote directs him to a previous historical work on the Atlantic slave trade. So he goes and looks up that previous work, and it has the number of 20 million. Again, a reputable historian referring to the fact that the Atlantic slave trade was 20 million people. So looking at the footnote in the work that was footnoted by the historian he was reading originally, he saw that that was footnoted, right? And so what he did was he followed these chain of footnotes back because he wanted to know where the original figure of the Atlantic slave trade volume came from. And what he discovered by following this chain of footnotes was that the original estimate for the Atlantic slave trade came from a pamphlet that was produced by abolitionists who were opposed to slavery. It was a pamphlet that was basically talking about how bad and evil the slave trade is. As a side note, the slave trade is bad and evil, but he was looking at it because that's where the original figure came from. And the original figure didn't have any rigorous academic research behind it. It was part of a propaganda pamphlet. So what Curtin realized is that there hadn't been any systematic accounting of how big the Atlantic slave trade was. And so he went out to figure it out. And so that footnote launched him on this book, The Atlantic Slave Trade, a Census, which came out, I believe, in 1969, right? It was controversial. It was controversial because what Curtin said was that the Atlantic slave trade was about 11 million people. So roughly half the volume of what the accepted thinking was for the Atlantic slave trade in terms of how many people were dragged across, right? Some people were critical because they said, or they thought, not that they necessarily said that, but it implied that the Atlantic slave trade was not as bad as people thought because it was only half as big, which of course is incorrect. The true volume of the Atlantic slave trade doesn't mitigate the horrors that it inflicted, right? So clarifying this volume of slave trade was something that brought this issue under more rigorous academic study, right? And so that's what Curtin does in that book. He opened up this analysis of the slave trade to a realm of historical inquiry that focuses on data and demographic estimates drawn upon a much sturdier set of figures to arrive at that. And the book is about him justifying where the volume comes from each part. So where does, so with this figure, by the way, his numbers have been, since his book came out in 1969, historians have further refined his number and it has kind of drifted up to about 13 million. So the estimate for the volume of the Atlantic slave trade is about 13 million people were taken from Africa and brought to the New World in the slave trade, right? It doesn't make it any less horrible that it's only 13 million as opposed to 20 million, right? But those numbers are much more sturdy, let's say, right? There's a lot of research behind it to demonstrate it. So thinking about this Atlantic slave trade, where did these slaves go to?
The Americas.
The Americas. That takes us from the tip of Tierra del Fuego all the way to the Yukon Peninsula. Can you narrow it down a little bit more? Let me rephrase that question, right? since we're in the United States, what volume of the slave trade went to the United States as a percentage? What would you guess? Anyone?
20%.
20%? Okay. Other guesses?
40%.
40%, right? The United States, right, is what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. Other guesses? Abby, what do you think?
I thought 40 sounded pretty good.
40, 45?
Sure, yeah.
Ryan, what do you guess? What do you think, Brian?
30%.
Okay. Danny?
I'd probably say like 45. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's have a look, shall we? I have to do this off of Blackboard, by the way, because the laptop I use doesn't have hasn't paid for Adobe in a long time, so it won't let me open PDFs without paying for Adobe. So I'm using a ramshackle laptop to do all my zooming. Okay, so this is a map from a textbook. So textbooks do provide us useful material, and it's the volume of the slave trade. This little portion right here is the portion of the slave trade that went to what becomes the United States. It is about 5% of the Atlantic slave trade, which means 95% of the Atlantic slave trade went to somewhere else aside from what becomes the continental United States, right? So this tells us something about the slave trade. It tells us that North America was peripheral for the slave trade. And it also tells us that where the lion's share of the slaves went to were places that are the Caribbean and South America, right? So we can also see where these slaves come from. So the various portions of the African continent where these folks come from. Also, by the way, this is a very comprehensive slave trade. It also tells us something else that was going on. There was a much smaller version of the slave trade out of Africa that was going into the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean world, right? We're going to talk about some aspect of those two components of the slave trade in outside of Africa, and also some measure of what slavery meant inside of Africa, right? But the Atlantic slave trade is different. But the vast majority of this slave trade didn't go to the Americas. We'll talk about why that's the case in just a minute. So our perceptions of slavery and the Atlantic slave trade, let me amend that statement. It's not our perceptions of slavery. The business of slavery in the United States was enormously important to the slaveholding states. Eradicating that came at the cost of 750,000 Americans north and south, and enormous amounts of blood and treasure to end this system of slavery in the United States. So it's not that slavery is not important to the United States. It is immensely important. But this slavery is to North America is not an important component of the Atlantic slave trade, right? So the Atlantic slave trade as a business, the North American market only comprised 5% of the destination of their slaves, right? Of this slave business, telling us something about what these other businesses were, right? So slavery as an institution, as a thing, is older than recorded history. It seems that people long before things were recorded were enslaving other people to do their work, right? Or slaves formed concubines. Slaves formed status symbols, right? So slavery as a thing has a history longer than recorded history, right? But the Atlantic slave trade, according to Klein, has really only one thing that it can be compared to in terms of slavery: a previous slave system. What would it be and why?
Roman Empire,
Okay, the Roman Empire. Why?
because they actually relied on it. Like it was such a significant part of their workforce that it was really not necessary, I guess.
Okay.
Not
What did they apply this workforce to?
agriculture,
Agriculture. Good. And what particular kind of agriculture?
plantation.
Okay, plantations do what?
I don't remember. Like what crop?
Yeah, some of the crops.
I don't remember.
Or let me amend that. So we can talk about the crops, right? Or we can talk about what the crops were produced for.
They were produced for like urban people that like didn't have agriculture.
Okay, right? So what type of things?
Sugar.
Not yet, not yet.
Mm.
Sugar we're gonna talk about in a bit. Sugar was not important in the Roman Empire. It becomes important in the Mediterranean world later. One could argue, I guess, the sugar was important for the Eastern Roman Empire. But thinking about the Western Roman Empire, not yet, right? But we'll talk about that because it becomes very important. Marshall, what were they producing? What are they producing for the urban population?
I don't remember exactly what the crop was.
What would you want?
Well, I'd assume some sort of grain
Right.
that they had.
It's the grain business. They're growing wheat, right? They're growing wheat in plantations, not exactly the term of the time, but it'll fit. The plantations to grow wheat for the export market, right? So one important task that slaves were put to work on was producing wheat to feed the 1 million people in Rome, right? And other places. What else? What are some of the things you think about in Italy today?
Tomatoes?
Tomatoes? Tomatoes come because of the Columbian Exchange. So this predates.
Would alcohol be one?
Any particular type?
Wine?
Wine, right? Slaves were used to help produce wine. Wine is for an export market, right? Anything else? It's very important to the Spaniards.
Like olive oil?
Olive oil, right? What is that used for?
Making bread.
Export market, right? So these are things that are being produced on the large scale for export. So they're not producing a lot of wheat in North Africa so that they can have fine bread, right? They're producing a lot of wheat to sell or to ship to parts of the Roman Empire where there's a lot of people and not a lot of food production, right? They're producing wine because people in the Roman Empire like to drink wine, so they're selling it, right? How is this being produced? A landowner has his slaves who are working to produce this product that they're going to sell for export, right? It's not that the landowner is creating a large vineyard so that he can bathe in his wine. He's producing it for sale, right? An export market. This mature export market is a function of the empire, right? And for the Romans, it is the one that's most analogous to what the Atlantic slave trade business is, because these slaves are put to work growing things for profit-making opportunities by the owners, right? The Atlantic slave trade is in terms of production, is a very curious system, right? It is, so slavery is a system that's time out of mind, right? Long before we could record stuff, some king or priest or something was defeating their enemies, taking them, the losers, and putting them to work for them, whether it's building, a new pyramid or, having 100 wives, whatever, right? Something that is used, but it's not used for production to sell things abroad, right? So the Atlantic slave trade system is a system that's built on it's an age-old system. It's slavery, it's compelled labor, right? It's growing stuff, right? So it's a rural economy, but it's combined with a type of production that is much more modern, like a factory production. So it's a curious hybrid of an age-old, rural-based, backwards labor producing system, slavery, right? But it's being wedded to a type of production of mass production. And mass production for an export economy, we're going to talk in just a moment about the products of this plantation economy. But just in terms of production, it's a curious melding of an age-old rural practice and a modern factory style practice, right? And I suppose this is a question that you guys can answer, because I've seen the video so many times that I can't quite remember if it's part of the section that got clipped out for this online version or not, right? So did you see the production on the sugar plantation?
I think so.
Okay, good. So how did it work?
There were big stalks of sugar cane, and the slaves had to cut it down.
Okay, who cuts it down?
The slaves.
Okay. Does anybody know anything about how sugar grows or anything about it?
Does it have to be next to water?
Okay, right. It's a very thirsty crop, right? Sugar is a very thirsty crop, so it needs lots of water, right? What else about it? Anybody know anything about sugar? Any biologists? Who are my biology students?
My one bit of knowledge came from Minecraft, so.
Touche.
Sugarcane is part of the grass family, right? So it grows in sort of like stalks of grass, except they're greatly, it's a member of the cane, or it's a cane as opposed to like a blade of grass, but it's from that family. And so the way that sugar is produced, so in that video, you see them hacking down sugarcane, right? They're marching through this stand of sugarcane with their machetes, chopping it down, right? Do they then stop and bundle it up and put it onto carts and deliver it?
Don't they have to process it?
Okay. Who is it? The same people who cut it down who process it? The historian from Johns Hopkins actually refers to how this operation works in his terminology.
Isn't it different groups? Like there's those in the field and those in the factory, or
correct? He refers to the people with the machetes as the cutting gang, right? They mow through this field of sugarcane, hacking it down, right? And you can see them hacking it down and trimming off quickly some of the pieces of it and then throwing it behind them. There's another group of folks who come along and gather those that sugarcane into rows, right? There's a third group who come along and load the cane onto carts, and then they take it to the sugar mill. And what goes on at the sugar mill? Some of this is a function of sugar, by the way, but go ahead.
Did it get crushed?
Okay, crushed to do what?
Did it become sugar?
It's gotta be boiled down, right?
Okay, right? Is it the same people who do the cutting?
No,
No,
Is it the same people who put it on the carts?
no.
no.
The operation is broken down just like thinking about a factory. In a factory, on an assembly line, there are people who do a small portion of the task, and that's all they do, right? The cutters, that's all they do is they cut down cane 12, 16, 18 hours a day, right? Because the sugar cane needs to be cut when it's ready for processing. And then another group puts it in the rows and another group delivers it to the mill. And when it gets to the mill, there's a group of folks who are running it through the crusher, right? So they crush the cane and squeeze out the liquor, right? The juice that's in the sugar cane. They take that liquor and they put it in big cauldrons where it's cooked. It's cooked to crystallize, right? And then they have people, the footage in the video is showing big paddles doing it. Well, it used to be people who had these big paddles that would continually stir this cooking mixture because the sugar crystallizes. If you don't stir it, then it burns and scorches, right? So each part of this is part of the process. And there's two elements about it. One is the element of the sugar cane itself. And this is why this process, the beginning process, occurs in the places where sugarcane is grown. Sugarcane needs to be processed within about 24 hours after it's cut or it begins to spoil. So on the front end, this is a process that needs rapid attention to it, right? So if you have somebody cutting cane, they can't say, we'll get to it tomorrow. It's a process that as it's cut, it has to be processed right away. So you can't interrupt the two. The other part about it is in economic terms, right? In order to make a sugar mill work, first off, it's a capital intensive business. Mario, what does capital intensive mean?
I'm not too sure.
Okay, what's capital? It's another word for capital.
Is that like money?
Money.
Or like
Money, right? Money works. Capital is money. What's intensive mean? What does it mean to be intense? Who can help Mario out? Intensive. What's it mean?
Need a lot of it.
Right. So put them together. Capital intensive means
High demand.
what?
Said high demand.
High demand.
Need a lot of money to make it happen.
What did we say capital means?
Money. Oh,
Money.
money.
Need a lot of money.
You need a lot of money, right? Sugar mills are capital intensive businesses because you need a lot of money to invest in it, right? You got to build the physical structure of the mill, right? And it's expensive to operate, right? It requires a lot of energy input in order to get the cauldrons up to temperature, in order to crystallize the liquor, the sugar, right? And so that process requires a lot of input as well, energy input, which requires money, which means that a energy hungry business like a sugar mill, it's cheaper to keep it running than it is to heat it up, and then when it cools down to heat it up again, because you got to put more energy into getting it up to temperature than you do when it's up to temperature to keep the temperature, right? So what that means is when a sugar mill runs, it runs most effectively when it's running all the time. Most economically is when it's running 24/7. But in order to be running 24/7, that means you have to be feeding it sugar the whole time, right? Crushing the cane and boiling it and crystallizing it in the vats, right? Which means that a sugar mill needs to have a wide variety of sugar to process. So sugar mills are things that operate on the large scale most efficiently. So that means a lot of property growing sugarcane or a regular source of sugarcane. So you could have 5 or 6 property owners who are growing sugarcane and only one person who owns the mill, right? So the other sugar owners have to pay him a fee for using his mill, but the mill has to have a broad access of sugarcane in order to run most effectively and most efficiently, right? So this is a system that effectively works on the larger scale. So again, that's even more capital intensive. You have to have enough land under sugarcane growing in order to feed the mill to make it run. It's not economically sound to produce any sugar in any volume if you're, you have only enough sugarcane to keep the mill running for 5 days, right? That's not anywhere near economically sound. So that whole system is one that generates, it needs a lot of product. So the Atlantic slave trade system it's like a factory. You have a cutting gang, you have the guys who are stirring in the sugar mill, you have the crushing gang. All these things are part of the process that are like a factory, as opposed to growing stuff on a farm. Now, what are they growing? Sugar is one of these things. What are they growing? What are they growing it for?
To sweeten things.
Sugar is used to sweeten things. So you own a plantation growing sugar. Are you producing hundreds of pounds of sugar just because you have a super sweet tooth?
Well, you're gonna sell it. It's not all for you.
Right? Sell it where?
In Europe.
Okay. And it's being grown where?
In the Americas.
Okay. That's where the system evolves to. But the point I'm trying to make in terms of where this production, you're growing stuff for the export market. That's why the Roman system of slavery is analogous. They're growing grain in North Africa to sell throughout the Mediterranean in urban areas where they can't grow their own grain. They're growing olive oil to sell to people all around the Mediterranean world, right? It's grown to be an export crop. Now, sugar is a particularly nice export crop. So what are the attributes of an export crop? So just thinking abstractly, we don't have to limit ourselves just to sugar. What is it? What are the type of things that make a good export crop?
High demand.
High demand, right? That's good, right? What else?
It has to be able to last the whole trip to be sold. It can't.
Right? Or you need faster ships, but yeah, right? What else? Thinking just abstractly about export crops.
The like utility that the crops like have for them, like the
What do you
purpose
mean
of
by
them.
utility?
Like for the sugar, you said like they said that it was just for, like the sweet and stuff, but like the factors that the crops have from them.
Okay. We can even be a little cynical, if we would like, Danny, and suggest things that are not only people have a desire for, like sugar, but potentially something that may be addictive, that they must have, right? Sugar is mildly addictive, right? People, when they get the taste of something sweet, would like more of that sweetness, right? What else?
Tobacco.
Tobacco. Are we talking about what else is addictive, or what are we
Sure.
back at the
So
first question?
tobacco is a good export crop because it's addictive, right? Tatiana, what are you going to say?
Sorry, it muted itself. I was gonna say tobacco
Okay, tobacco.
or
Alright,
alcohol. Either would work.
okay. Is alcohol necessarily a good export crop? Generic alcohol, how's that?
Probably not.
Okay, right. It can be if it can be produced cheaper, right? But this is the other aspect of an export crop. Can you make alcohol in London?
No.
You can't? Why can't you?
I guess you could make alcohol. You probably couldn't make
Alcohol.
wine.
Yes. Yes, you can make alcohol. Yes.
Okay.
Can you grow sugarcane in London?
No.
No. Right? Can you grow good tobacco? I am not a tobacco aficionado, but as I understand it, certain types of or certain tobaccos from certain locations in the world are more desirable. So can you grow tobacco in the suburbs of London?
Probably not.
No, right? The thing that makes a good export crop is that it's a product that there's a demand for, sugar, tobacco, that can't be grown everywhere. It can only be grown in certain locations. That's certainly true for sugar. Sugar is a plant that needs a lot of water. It needs a certain amount of frost-free days. I want to say it's like 280 something, right? So it has to have a warm growing environment. It's a tropical plant, right? It was domesticated in South Asia and migrated to places where it could grow. But because it can only grow within certain water and temperature ranges, it limits where it can be grown. So that makes it a great export crop. Tobacco has a little bit wider variety of places it can grow, but it can't grow everywhere, right? And then tobacco has on top of it that it's addictive, right? So people will go out of their way to acquire more of it, right? Many of these export crops are things that are in demand in other places, first as a luxury good, but then it expands to even further, and they can't be grown in the markets where there's a high demand, right? Sugar was the case until the 19th century when sugar beets began to replace much of the sugar cane production, right? So sugar beets, I believe it was during the Napoleon's reign in France that they developed and began to utilize widespread sugar production using beets. Well, sugar beets you can grow in Europe, so it undercuts that exclusive market of sugar cane production, right? That's what makes a good export crop, right? All right, so the model for production in the Atlantic slave trade business, or the plantation economy, let's leave it at that. The plantation economy is this hybrid, right, of sort of a factory production and a rural production. They weren't studying the Romans to get ideas about how to produce sugarcane. Where did the people who end up colonizing the Americas, the Europeans, first encounter sugar production? And what does it tell us about this system? That's a long way to get around to the point of where did sugar production as an industry on a plantation begin?
It started in South America.
Did it start in South America or was it transplanted to South America?
Probably transplanted there.
Okay, right? It was brought with the colonizers to the New World. The first person to bring sugarcane, by the way, was Christopher Columbus, right? So Christopher Columbus must have known about sugarcane production. Where would he have learned it? Where did those European states or kingdoms first encounter it?
Asia.
Asia where?
Like China area, maybe.
Okay. It wasn't European voyagers to China who encountered sugarcane. They knew about it before that, at least as in terms of a system of production. How's that? I'm not going to say that at some point they didn't taste sugar before this, but this exposed Europeans to this type of production.
India.
Why India?
I don't know.
I don't know if
Who's to
Alexander
guess?
the Great encountered sugar. He may have, but he did not bring back the plantation system to Greece.
Was it along the Mediterranean in a town called like Sao something? It was like SAO space. I just don't know how to say it.
Sao Tome or however it's called.
Altomi. That is an island off of Africa, but it's not in the Mediterranean. But you're on the right path.
It was on an island in the Pacific.
Not the Pacific.
The Mediterranean.
So the first place that Europeans encountered this system was during the Crusades. When the Europeans invaded what they called the Holy Land, they encountered the production of sugar. And in fact, sugar plantations were some of the awards some of the prominent knights got. And the system they encountered was a plantation system of production relying upon slaves. But the slaves they encountered on these plantations were a mixture of folks. There were Christians who were enslaved by the Muslims on these properties. There were Jews who were enslaved on these properties. Although technically it was illegal for a member of Islam to enslave another member of Islam, there were Muslim slaves on there. There were Africans on there. So the slave force system was multi-religious and multi-ethnic, but it was a slave-based production system. They were growing sugarcane, processing it, and producing sugar. And these crusaders found they enjoyed it. So it's strange to think about, I think, because sugar is such a widespread component of our diet. But prior to the arrival of Europeans into the Middle East in the form of the Crusades, the only thing that sweetened people's food was honey. So they had not encountered sugar. Sugar was a very rare and very expensive product, and it was generally used as a medicine and was a sign of high status. Really only the royals would even get a taste of sugar. So this exposure to sugar was something that not only did the Crusaders enjoy, but the products traveled back to Europe where people developed a taste for it. In terms of the Middle East, the Mediterranean area, the Crusaders in these Crusader kingdoms, they began to produce sugar, and they produced it in the same way that they saw was being produced before. And across the Mediterranean, where it was suitable to grow the crop, sugar production began to increase. So the lower portions of Italy and especially Sicily, right? Some of the lower portions of the Iberian Peninsula were hot enough and wet enough to grow sugar. So Melissa, the place you're talking about is where this progression continued, because as a type of production, plantation-based export crop, sugar mill, gang slave labor was the system of production in the Mediterranean world that these Portuguese primarily and the Spanish to a lesser degree began to take out of the mouth of the Mediterranean, and they began to try and install it onto the islands off the coast of Africa. The Canaries, the Madeiras, these islands were colonized by Portuguese primarily, and on these places where they could grow sugar, they began to grow sugar. This system of sugar production relies upon slaves, right? That's how they encountered it. That's how they adopted it. And so off the coast of Africa, the Portuguese began to build sugar plantations, and they relied on the workforce they could get. Well, increasingly off the coast of Africa, that became an African workforce. We'll see it in our last book. One of the essays talks about this development of racism. Well, racism is an outgrowth of the Atlantic slave trade business, right? The idea of being enslaved was not something that was color bound until the Atlantic slave trade, until the Atlantic slave trade becomes established in the Americas, right? So that's when this system became color bound, this racist idea of someone's color or ethnicity being a slave. Prior to the Atlantic slave trade, lots of people were enslaved, right? And lots of different ethnicities, and their status as a slave was why they were jumbled together, not because they were different sorts. For that matter, where does the term slave come from?
The Slavic people.
Right, and where are they from?
The Balkans.
Right. So the Slavs were the origin of the term slaves, and they were Caucasians, right? They're white. So that system of racism that develops is an outgrowth of the Atlantic slave trade business, as we shall see later, right? So as this system migrates with the European powers that are settling these islands, they're introducing a system of production, gang slave labor, the plantation system, with which they are familiar. Is that what the Spanish thought they'd be doing when they arrived in the New World?
They didn't expect to be arriving in the New World in the first place.
So they did not expect to be arriving in the New World. After Christopher Columbus bumped into it the first time, then they could anticipate that they were going to land in territories. It took some of them. Christopher Columbus went to his grave insisting that he had found a region off the coast of China. Or India. He was about the only person left by that time in learned communities who believed that. Most people believed they had somehow or another encountered a new world that they knew nothing about, right? So now that the Spanish know that it's not East China or East India, right? What are they intending to do?
look for natural resources like gold.
Okay. And the Spanish conquistadors are going to put down their swords and take off their armor and start digging.
They're gonna steal it if they can.
Okay. And how are they going to steal it?
They want to conquer the people,
Okay. What people?
all the natives,
Okay. And what are they going to do with them?
kill them off or put them to use as slaves.
Right. They're not so keen on killing them off. They are keen on killing off the ruling class, some measure of the ruling class. They want to keep a portion of the ruling class to serve as their intermediaries, right? But what are they thinking they're going to do with all the, for lack of a better term, peasants in this system?
Try and put them to work.
Put them to work digging gold out of the ground, or digging silver out of the ground, or putting them to work on plantations, right? Raising cattle for their hides, running sheep for their wool, anything, right? Producing sugar on their plantations that they're going to sell back in Europe, right? Christopher Columbus didn't bring sugarcane because he thought that would be something nice to have with his morning coffee, right? He brought sugarcane because he thought maybe this will be a crop we can establish here that can start producing sugar, which will make a lot of money, because sugar was highly remunerative, right? There was, the more people got a taste of sugar in Europe, the more people who wanted sugar, the more people who got sugar wanted more sugar. So the introduction of sugar into the European palate was something that was driving a high rate of demand. So being able to fill that demand by producing sugar was a lucrative business, right? And people who owned property in those islands off the coast of Africa were making good money selling hogshead of sugar to, in the Portuguese market and then to the wider European market, right? What happens to the Spanish dreams of employing in large number this Native American populations to do their work?
They start dying.
Okay, right? As we've seen, right? So now we're at a fork in the road. The Spanish, their plan is to utilize the Mayan or the Incas or the Aztecs or any myriad group of folks who are falling under their command to work on plantations for them. But their workforce is disappearing in two fashions. One, because their fellow, because this is where they live and their fellow ethnics and fellow groups, right? They can leave and go run off to their relatives and so evade the Spanish because, they just, this is where they live. It's easier for them to escape the constraints of serving as slaves, right? So that's part of it. But the bigger part of it is why we spend so much time talking about Crosby, right? The murderous transfer of epidemic diseases from Eurasia to the New World results in large-scale population decline, population that the Spaniards were planning on using as their workforce, right? So we're at a fork in the road. They can either ratchet up the importation of people from Spain to come work in, the silver mines or raising sugar or whatever, right? Or they could draw upon an alternative labor source. What experience do they have with an alternative labor source, and where is it? Spanish and Portuguese.
Be in Africa.
Okay. In Africa or off the coast of Africa?
Off the coast, rather.
Okay, right. So I have a link to an article, another article from Philip Curtin called Epidemiology in the Slave Trade. right? You guys can read it or not, it's up to you. But what that article illustrates is the impact of the New World on 3 sets of groups, right? For the first set of groups, it's not the New World. This is where they live, the Native American populations, right? The impact of the arrival of Europeans and Africans has dramatic impact on them. And we talked about the arrival of Eurasians in general in terms of the Columbian Exchange. We didn't talk so much about those parts of Africa who are incorporated into this system who also come along, right? So the Eurasian diseases are those epidemic diseases, many, most of them respiratory, some enteric, right? Africans who come across, some of them, or they come from regions where there's 2 other types of epidemic diseases to which they are exposed to. Any guesses?
Would malaria be one?
Malaria is one of them. So there's 4 types of malaria. The one that is most deadly by far is Falciparum malaria. In regions of Africa, Falciparum malaria was endemic, even hyperendemic, meaning it's circulating at a high rate, which means malaria is something that you don't develop immunity to. You develop repeated exposure allows your body minimizes the symptoms, right? So it's not that you're not infectious or you're not carrying malaria, it's that your body has been sufficiently exposed to it that the impact is on your day-to-day is much milder than for somebody else, right? And so in regions where Falciparum was circulating all the time, everybody was exposed to it. Exposure as a child means over the course of your life, you're going to continually suffer these bouts of this malaria. And over time, you will develop relative resistance or immunity. Relative, it's not absolute, right? It means that in your blood, at various times, the stages of the malaria parasite can be found. So it means that, and the mechanism of transference, the malaria process is very involved. It goes back and forth between humans and mosquitoes at various stages of its development, which is why it took a long time to make the absolute connection that mosquitoes carry malaria, because the life cycle is very involved between humans and these mosquitoes. The life cycle has to occur in both organisms, right? So it's a complicated intermixing, right? But that means that people coming from Africa, some of them, if they come from regions where it's hyperendemic, means that they're carrying these parasites in their blood. So when they come to the New World, there's mosquitoes in the New World too. They can bite an African, whether it's somebody who's a slave or not, who is actively carrying malaria parasites and can serve to set off this chain of transmission, right? So it's relatively easy. The other one is yellow fever. And yellow fever is, it's a viral disease, but it's one that when you survive it, you get lifelong immunity. In regions where yellow fever was endemic, that means as a child, you were exposed to yellow fever and you're either gonna die, in which case you can't carry malaria or yellow fever anymore, or you're going to survive and never contract it again. So living to adulthood in regions where yellow fever is endemic, that means you've had it and survived it. Yellow fever took a longer time to come across because it required bringing the mosquito inadvertently from those regions to the New World, because yellow fever is much more closely tied to a particular type of mosquito, but it was inevitable. So Africans come to the New World having been exposed to the Eurasian diseases, but also having 2 new very deadly diseases that come with them to the New World. This is a double onslaught for Native peoples. And so they suffer very high rates of mortality because of the Eurasian diseases and also because of yellow fever and malaria. The Eurasian population, non-African population who comes to the New World, they have immunity to those Eurasian diseases, but they're as susceptible as Native peoples to Falciparum malaria and yellow fever. So the combination of those things are absolutely devastating for Native American populations, and they're very deadly for white European populations. And for that matter, they're very deadly to African populations who don't come from regions where yellow fever was endemic. They're just as susceptible as anybody else, right? So what that means is in the New World, this comes together in a cauldron that is murderous to the Native American population in very high rates, murderous to the white population in high rates, because the only way to develop immunity is through exposure, which is going to kill a lot of people to be exposed. And then for the African population, they're more likely to survive. So I'm going to pick up next week with that brief discussion of tying the epidemiology together in terms of the labor force. And then we're going to go on with the rest of the material on our next section of Klein. So keep up with your reading on Klein. If you have any questions about the paper or anything, please shoot me an email and I will see you, excuse me,